And we are back on the 0 hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and again, this is the post-Trump, post-traumatic edition of the show. Joining us now is Katy Waldman. Katy is the words correspondent for Slate.com. She had written before the election about Trump's use of language, and of course, she, like so many of us, is now recovering from the new reality. But first of all, Katy, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
Secondly, how are you holding up?
Oh gosh. Not too well, not too well. I think it's been sort of a despairing veil of tears over here in the Slate offices, and I'm sure that a lot of people can relate to that feeling. Um, I'm sure you feel the same way. But I think like some of the real gloom and hopelessness has dispersed a bit, and now people are trying to sort of lick their wounds and get back up and figure out what's next.
Yeah, I think it's time. I think we're all going to have to adapt to the new reality and then figure out what we're going to do about it. So, and as we look at that, look, obviously, most of us were blindsided by this victory. Some of us saw that there was more method to Trump's seeming madness than others of us did. And I will say, I have always maintained that for the audience he was targeting, he was actually a very effective communicator, even though people, including me, mocked his communication style. And you wrote a piece which takes on more resonance now that Trump is president elect, which is still appalling to say, but called Trump's Tower of Babble, and the subheading it was given was, "It may sound like gibberish, but there is an accidental brilliance to Trump's style of speech." Well, we're going to be hearing that speech for 4 more years now. Yeah, I know. And you said you started out by saying for some of us it's incendiary garbage, which it is, but it's a very unorthodox relationship to the English language. But tell me why you found it in its own way effective, as you said, but it works.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and I think a lot of it does have to do with the sort of unstudied feel of it. It seems very authentic, as if it's just kind of spooling out of him. But in my piece, I argue that like some of the things that make his rhetoric so powerful are that he uses very simple component parts. So the words themselves tend to be monosyllabic. He talks just below a sixth grade reading level. He uses very simple constructions. Um, and then he also is actually so incoherent that particular emotionally powerful words that he uses kind of jump out at you. Like there's this kind of verbal morass of nonsense, and then he'll say something like death or poverty or terror or something, and like the connotations of that word will sort of reverberate, and because he's not making a lot of sense, you just sort of like get this abiding impression of sinister things,
Or
and
whatever
so
he
it's kind of
wants to
this dark
convey to you,
innuendo.
right? You get that abiding. It's usually sinister, but it's whatever he wants to convey. Katy, that's a great as a great analysis to me. It fits with what I've been saying all along about Trump's language, but it articulates it better than I have, which is basically that I've always had the impression that Trump, when he speaks, is speaking directly to the lizard brain. It's like
Hmm.
he's bypassing the intellect altogether. Even when he says win, you're going to win, you'll be winning, there'll be so much winning, you'll be sick of winning because you'll be winning. It's like my intellect says, well, that's a whole string of stupid sentences, but somewhere in the lizard brain is saying, yeah, I would like to win a lot.
Yeah, and I think also you also brought up indirectly the way he repeats certain phrases and words. And there have actually been studies showing that the more something is repeated, the more the brain kind of processes it very fluently and believes it to be true. Just repetition makes things ring truer. So that also helps him. And also there's kind of a bullying quality, I think, to the way that he keeps oppressing us with the same words and phrases over and over, as if you just like can't get out from under his intended meaning.
Yeah, yeah. It's almost like he's battering your ears into submission somehow.
Yeah.
With I'll tell you something. I'll tell you a story. And again, we're talking with Katy Waldman, who's words correspondent for Slate.com. A friend told me something very interesting, which is that my friend is a technical, a very top technical expert in a certain field, and he's had 3 meetings with Trump in 3 different contexts. One was a business meeting he didn't want to attend because he didn't want to do any business with Trump, but he was asked to. So one was a business meeting, one was a social event, and one was on the corporate jet of a very debauched fellow billionaire, and none of which he wanted to attend. But he said in those 3 different social contexts, Trump spoke completely differently. That he, in the business context, he was a very articulate business person. In the party context, he kind of used a kind of a louche, party language. And on the jet, I forget what he said the third one was, but he basically said that Trump adopted a speaking style suitable to the context he was in. Does that make sense to you at all?
Huh. I mean, that's very interesting because my impression of Trump as a speaker is someone who's not particularly disciplined and not really not he doesn't necessarily seem to be following a strategy so much as sort of saying whatever pops into his head. But I do think there are ways in which his political rhetoric really tries to announce itself as political rhetoric. I wrote in the piece about discourse markers and how he uses a whole lot more of them than many of his competitors in the primary field. So he'll say things like, by the way, and and so, and frankly, and honestly, just sort of words that add emotional content to the statement without actually changing its meaning. And it seems like when he does that, he's sort of drawing attention to the fact that he's speaking and to the fact that he's orating specifically. And I think maybe that's one way that he is trying to present himself as a real politician, someone who gives speeches and communicates and talks to his constituents.
Yeah, you've read, as I have read, the George Lakoff piece on and George Lakoff is a cognitive linguist on Trump, where he said that he exploits prefaces like, "Well, people are saying," or "I've heard this many times." That he's doing that, you wrote, to burnish his credibility. That was your paraphrase of Lakoff. But you also said you thought something else was going on, that he's too distracted by the pleasure and theater of vocalizing to deliver any actual substance. I mean, so you create this mental picture, in my mind anyway, of Trump kind of caught in this feedback loop of pleasuring himself with his own words, so that he becomes like a mouse on a wheel, just running for the sake of running with no destination. I don't know. Is that first of all a correct interpretation of how you read Trump?
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. That's a very indelible image. I like it a lot.
And now, but Lakoff saw more sort of cunning in it. Lakoff suggests it's a strategy, but I suppose, I guess, as we think about it, Katy Waldman, it could be both, couldn't it?
Yeah, and I certainly think he's probably been coached in some ways, and maybe he's just sort of learned on the road. I I don't want to give him so much credit as to say he's a rhetorical mastermind, but I guess what he's doing is working. It certainly makes him sound authoritative. So
Maybe what he is, Katy, is he's a rhetorical predator who has certain strategies that he uses to track and trap his prey being the listener. And so maybe mastermind gives him too much credit, but he has some sort of stratagem that he applies to different situations. You also quoted him, you referred to the fact that he said he was encouraging his followers to monitor, quote unquote, polling places in urban districts, and he said go down to certain areas, make sure other people don't come in and vote 5 times. You're pointing out that these are well, you didn't call them code words. You called them provocatively undefined. I would say, isn't that a strategy? And isn't that a strategy that taps into racism without using the specific language of racism?
Yeah, I think there are a few things that dog whistling helps Trump accomplish. Obviously, there's the escaping total accountability because he can just deny that that's what he meant, while also transmitting the message that he is hoping will rile up his support base. But I also think that just from the effectiveness of the message standpoint, when you don't specifically define exactly what you're talking about, you allow people to sort of fill in the blank spaces with their own very, personal and intense for them imaginings. And so, in fact, the things that you're saying take on special force and impact because the listener is doing so much to contribute to the meaning of what you're saying. So I think those are two ways that his dog whistling strategy actually helps him out a lot.
Yeah, it's almost like he creates placeholders where you can put in the image of the people you hate and fear the most. One of the things that struck me about the Trump campaign language, especially toward the end, is how much he adopted some of the code, or not, I don't want to say code language, some of the buzzwords of the Bernie Sanders campaign without, of course, proposing anything like Bernie Sanders' solutions or messages, and maybe not even meaning the same things by them. But he used words like rigged game, the game is rigged, elites, a couple other phrases. But when Bernie Sanders used them, you knew he meant rigged by, most people knew he meant rigged by, corporate interests or Wall Street. When he talked about elites, you knew he meant wealthy and powerful billionaire corporate class and so on. But there again, I felt that Trump was adopting language that had been successful for another candidate. And as we talk about it, you and I, Katy Waldman, I feel as if there again he found that he could use those too as placeholders. Maybe that when he says rigged, well, rigged by whom? Rigged how? When he says elites, well, that could mean anybody you dislike again. It could mean African Americans. It could mean Jews. It could mean reporters who he fostered a lot of hate for. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think that's absolutely fascinating, and one of the biggest threats that Trump poses, and one thing that really differentiates him from a lot of the other politicians out there, is that he just doesn't seem to have any sense that words have meaning and that language has meaning. Like, he will use language to get from point A to point B, but again, there's this kind of appalling lack of substance underneath all of it. And one person, I can't remember who wrote this, someone suggested that the reason he's effective is his supporters take him seriously but not literally, in that they believe what they believe about him and nothing that he actually says changes their view of him. Whereas the people who are scared of Trump take him literally but not seriously. So they will believe that he will do the things that he says he's going to do, but they don't think that he's a serious candidate. And I think that there's a way in which he just sort of says anything, uses whatever language he wants, and doesn't feel like he needs to be accountable to that at all.
Which makes him, it's so interesting, Katy. It makes him radical in a very kind of meta way that I think we're going to have to spend, or be forced to spend years figuring out now. But, William S. Burroughs, the beat writer, said language is a virus from space, which I never took seriously as a statement. But Donald Trump's language does seem to have this kind of computer virus quality. It has no purpose other than to infect and reproduce and gain in power. I don't know. Any closing thoughts before we sign off on what we should be looking for in Donald Trump's language going forward?
No, I'm just trying to think what would be the most effective way for the country to receive this language, because as you mentioned, we're going to get a whole lot more of it over the next 4 years. And so I guess I would just encourage listeners to be very conscious of what exactly he's saying, and maybe try to rise above some of these accidentally brilliant and horrible rhetorical strategies if we can.
And maybe to recognize, based on your observations, that what he says has no sincerity or inherent meaning, is just designed to control you. Um, I guess, but I guess unfortunately we're going to have to leave it there. So, Katy Waldman, words correspondent for Slate.com, thanks for writing such incisive analysis of Trump's language, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
And we will be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.